Lord, guide us by your Spirit, the way of your cross that leads to your abundant peace and grace. Amen. The night before he died, Jesus sat with his disciples to share the Passover meal, a meal of remembrance celebrated every year by the Jewish people. And during this meal, Jesus broke bread and poured wine in remembrance of the mighty works of God. More specifically, Jesus and his disciples shared a meal of remembrance for the way God freed his people out of slavery in the land of Egypt, with the promise that they will find his land of rest. And for thousands of years, the Jewish people have continued this tradition of remembering the slavery of their ancestors and God's miraculous work to set them free. Jesus participated in this act of remembrance because he wanted to keep the story of God's saving power at the forefront of his disciples' minds as he completed the work that he had come into this world to do. At the close of his life on earth, Jesus shared a meal with his disciples to remind them of the work of God for his chosen people, freeing them from slavery. And at the same time, Jesus shared this meal with his disciples to show them the continuing work of God in himself and what he was about to do for all who would believe in him. The history of God freeing his people from slavery in Egypt shows us who we are as humans and who he is as God. It shows our weakness, our hopelessness, and it shows us his power, his grace, and his mercy. It gives us hope, and it builds our faith. In the light of the life and ministry of Jesus, this story is also the power of God's promise of salvation for all who believe in him. After the final and most crushing plague struck down the firstborn in Egypt, Pharaoh finally relented and let the people of Israel go. The Israelites were led by God to the Red Sea and encamped on its shore. And of course, as the Israelites were making this journey, Pharaoh changed his mind. He gathered all the chariots in Egypt, and with his army, he pursued the people of God in order to bring them back into slavery. Remember, the Passover is the celebration of God freeing his people from slavery in Egypt. Though Pharaoh had agreed to set them free, he went back on his word. He pursued them with an army. As he closed in on the Red Sea, he saw the people of God encamped on its shore. While the Israelites thought they had escaped, they had not yet reached their promised rest. As they stand before a vast sea of destructive waves, they hear the thundering steps of the Egyptian army ready to take them back into slavery. The Israelites are faced with two dire choices: attempt to cross the sea with no boat and with no hope that their arms have strength to reach the opposite shore, or stay at their encampment, be overtaken by the Egyptians to either die by the sword or enter into a likely harsher condition of slavery than the one that they had just left. This feels like God is playing a cruel joke on the Israelites. He did wonders in Egypt, freed them from slavery, gave them favor to leave by the word of Pharaoh. And thus far, God has personally led them to the very shore where they are encamped. Did he really free them from slavery in Egypt only to give them this devastating choice? Either near certain death in the waves of the sea, or right back into the hands of the Egyptians and into slavery. Why give them hope, only to shatter it almost immediately? Now, we know that God is not one to delight in the meaningless suffering of his people, nor to lead them to certain death for his own amusement. This isn't just some cruel joke. God is doing something miraculous. The Israelites just can't see it yet. The crash of waves and stampeding hooves of war horses are reverberating to their core. They feel it in their chest as their hearts race over the dire outlook of being trapped between these two overwhelming obstacles, the vast sea and the encroaching army. And I wonder, does your life ever feel like this? We all face vast and unavoidable seas of suffering in our lives. Do you ever look out to a sea of lifelong loneliness and isolation, or exhaustion and fatigue of the work that is yet and ever remaining to be done? Unavoidable ailments, sickness unto death. These vast seas of suffering are all out of our control, and yet we each stand before them, hopeless that we might have the strength to cross to the opposite shore. And likewise, following behind us in this broken world is the army of darkness, powered by our own sin and the sin of others around us, which want to take us back into slavery. Have you ever turned back to see the mounting debt that you can't conceive ever paying off? A history of addiction that you thought you had kicked, trying to take you in once again. Broken trust of a relationship that once was full of love, but now instead brings pain when they come to mind. These armies chase all of us and will continue to pursue us as long as we walk in this broken world. What other vast seas of suffering might lie before you? What other encroaching army of sin might be marching from behind? And where is your hope when you are trapped in the midst of these overwhelming obstacles? Where do you place your faith when you have no hope? When we set time aside to remember the story of God's faithfulness to his people, we are preparing our hearts for a resilience of faith in the face of our suffering. In the midst of the changes and chances of our lives, much like the Israelites, we tend to hyper-focus on what is directly in front of us. Oftentimes, the promises of God are pushed out from our minds when our burdens become more than we can bear. We lean on our own understanding rather than trusting the power of God to do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. And I don't say this to dismiss the gravity of our overwhelming experiences. The seas of suffering and the armies of sin are truly overwhelming. They are truly more than we can handle. But by remembering the saving work that God has already completed, we are empowered to hope with faith that God will act again, even when our current circumstances are hopeless. Because our lives are hopeless without the power of God. When we are trapped between the vast sea of suffering that lies before us and the encroaching army of sin from behind, there is nothing that we can do to overcome those threats. Even if we could, more threats to our lives and livelihood will continue to come upon us as we live in this broken earth. We have no hope in this world. But in this world, we are not without hope. Our hope is just not of this world. We remember the power and the grace and the mercy of God to save his people because he has that same power, grace, and mercy to this day. And he acts out of his love for us, for the whole world, even in the most hopeless of circumstances. Even when we lose faith, he is faithful. This does not mean that God will put away every obstacle or danger in our lives, because God's promise is not that he will prevent suffering while we still live in this world. In fact, Jesus calls us to take up our cross and follow him. If we are to take this seriously, then we must expect suffering in this life, because the cross of Jesus is suffering. Jesus knew this as he celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples, revisiting the story of God's faithfulness to his chosen people, how he led them from slavery in Egypt. By his power, his grace, and his mercy, God made a way for the people of Israel to walk through the Red Sea on dry land and toppled the pursuing army of Pharaoh. The uncrossable sea was parted in two, not only making a way for God's people, but setting a trap for the army that would otherwise have overpowered and enslaved them. The overwhelming sea and its crushing waves, which had trapped the people of God as fodder for the Egyptians, was the very thing that God used to free the Israelites from that mighty army. He not only put the Israelites out of the Egyptians' reach, but he removed that army entirely as a danger to them. God saved his people using the very thing that otherwise would have all but guaranteed their destruction. And that is so like our God. As he celebrates the meal that remembers this saving work, Jesus himself is looking in the face of betrayal. One of his disciples, whom he loves, sitting at his table and sharing this meal, is about to hand him over to the corrupt religious rulers of Israel. They will put him to trial. He will be beaten and whipped, mocked, and have nails driven through his hands and feet into that cross of suffering that he calls on us to carry. This betrayal and torturous death by crucifixion were the vast sea of suffering that lay before Jesus as he remembered the saving work of God. The thing that all but guaranteed his death came in the form of a kiss from someone that he loves. The armies of darkness pursued him, influenced his captors, brought him into mockery and derision. There Pharaoh, Satan, the accuser, the father of lies, had what he thought was the last laugh by killing the Son of God at the hands of his own beloved people. Where is hope in suffering and death? What does it mean to be faithful in the midst of suffering? The work of God to save the people of God in the story of the Passover isn't the story of an end to suffering. As the parted sea surrounded them, how could the Israelites move forward but with fear and trembling, fully aware that the sea's destructive power could come crashing back upon them at any moment? And this is just the beginning of their long and hard journey. Freed from slavery in Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea into what would be 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before reaching that promised land. And even then, the people of God would go through centuries of attacks and oppression, dispersion, a split of their kingdom, and the destruction of 2 temples. The mark of the people of God is not freedom from suffering. It is not prosperity. It is not power over their enemies. The mark of the people of God is what we see in Jesus, as he remembered the mighty works of God with his disciples at the Passover meal. It is what we see in Jesus as he prepared for his own suffering and death once that meal was finished. What we see in Jesus is a complete and utter trust that God, even in the midst of suffering, can work wonders to take that suffering and turn it into joy. Not just for himself, but for all who believe and trust in that same miraculous work of God. The vast sea in front of Jesus, his suffering and death at the hands of the same people that he had come to save, was the very thing which would topple the army of Satan. destroy the power of death, and make a way for all to know and to receive the saving grace of God. Jesus knew that his suffering and death would lead to joy and abundant life for all who believe in him. And Jesus knew that he would walk into that suffering with the fullness of his own power and grace and mercy. The grace and mercy of God can take every vast sea of suffering and turn it into a miracle of salvation. He can take that very same suffering and turn it into joy and power to destroy the army of sin and darkness in our lives. Just like he did in Jesus, and just like he did for his people at the Red Sea all those centuries ago. But as the Israelites crossed the Red Sea by the power of God, they did not immediately enter into their promised rest. They wandered and suffered for 40 years in the wilderness. And through all of it, God was with them. The same God who freed them from slavery in Egypt continued to work miracles in their midst, even as they suffered. He continued to provide for them, to guide them, and to love them. Even when they were lacking in faith, God remained faithful. And in the same way, God walks with us through our suffering. His power, his grace, and his mercy is great enough to take our suffering and bring us into his saving grace through it. He made the story of his people in Egypt to be a story that would be repeated for centuries as a reminder of his saving power. And that same story foretells the story of our salvation in Jesus, his suffering and death on the cross, which has defeated the army of Satan once and for all. This story of salvation is the story that we need to remember, to repeat throughout our lives, because relying on the power and the grace and the mercy of God that this story promises us is the only way that we can face the vast sea of suffering and encroaching army of sin that would otherwise entrap us into hopelessness and certain death. Only God has the power to take the sea of suffering in your life and use it to destroy the army of sin. This does not mean that we mindlessly run headlong into our suffering and expect God to pick up the pieces after we're done. And it also doesn't mean that we cannot properly grieve our suffering. Even Jesus prayed, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But be careful not to let your grief turn to bitterness or your suffering into envy. Give it all up to our loving and compassionate God, who will comfort and strengthen you in his goodness through all circumstances of life. And before you turn your eyes back to that army of sin, remember the power of our saving God. If you put your trust in him, the army of sin will not overtake you. Look ahead at your sea of suffering with hope and wait with faith for God to do his work, even if he might work in a way that isn't as you would want or expect. Just as Jesus, knowing that he must suffer, submitted in his prayer, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus submitting to his suffering and death brings us to this night. Because he was willing to walk through the vast sea of suffering, we now stand with confidence to know the hope that rises with tomorrow's sun. The army of sin and death is defeated. We have a living hope. We have a reliable faith that the God who works miracles, who defeated death, is on our side. He will take your suffering. He will walk with you through it. And he will bring you to new life by his power and his grace and his mercy. Though we still wander for just a little while longer, in the wilderness of this life. Know that as we wander, God is doing miracles in our midst. He is with us, and our suffering will not be in vain, nor will it be our end. Because in Jesus, even death is not the end. We will not be left forsaken. And as we continue to face the vast sea of suffering, we know that there is a promised land with no more pain, where every tear will be wiped away. Remember that promise. Remember the history of God's continual faithfulness. And remember God's power to see his promises to the end, through the suffering of this life and into his eternal rest. Amen.